you have this thing. Good morning. I'm Rabbi Lustig. I want to welcome you to the Washington Hebrew Congregation's Amram Scholar Series. We're delighted. I have to tell you, I wasn't really happy when they said the headliner this morning was going to be Bad Rabbi, and then my name is moderated by Rabbi Lustig. So, Eddy Portnoy is our guest this morning. He's the academic advisor to the Max Weinreich Center and the head of exhibitor and curator at YIVO. He received his PhD in modern Jewish history from JTS, and I was great to hear that he wrote his dissertation on Yiddish comics. And that's comic strips, not Jewish comics, I believe. He is a specialist in popular Jewish culture. His academic works have appeared throughout articles and journals for both academic works. He has also written extensively for Tablet magazine and for the Forward on popular Jewish culture. This book is incredibly entertaining. And had I known and he had been a little more Jewish and a little less humble, he got a great review in the New York Times, which I just scanned, which speaks to it, but I can speak personally. The book is incredibly entertaining and fun. But it also pays careful attention to the journey of the Jew, and particularly the American Jew, from immigrant to assimilated mainstream individual. How Yiddish and the Yiddish Press produce some of what we would know as today as entertainment media. The Jew and the Jewish identity of the Jew is explicated through study and through story and through context. What is fascinating about this book is it goes from anywhere from talking about a murderer and an incredible story about the accused Jewish murderer, and all the way up through the rabbi, who is the Hasidic rabbi who is forced into marriage because the widow wants to become a rebbitzin, which is a great story. This is an incredibly entertaining story, but what is most fascinating is his journey that he takes us through, looking at the American Jew and looking how the American Jew has changed and how we can see that. His commentary in the book in between the stories is absolutely brilliant and is very entertaining. And as one person describes it, he discovers some of the times where we see the first Jerry Springer in Yiddish newspapers. And it is my great pleasure to give you Eddy Portnoy.
Okay. Thank you, Rabbi Lustig. Thank you, Leslie, for arranging all this. What was that? No, I know. Thanks. I will talk into the mic. Let me know if you can't hear me. Okay. Can this be turned up? Here. Better? All right. We'll see how this works. Thank you all very much for coming. I appreciate it. And thank you, Rabbi Lustig, for such a wonderful introduction. I think you may be exaggerating. Okay, so most Jewish history books are not about abortionists, murderers, rioters, prostitutes, bigamists, drunks, extortionists, psychics, and charlatans. But this one is. There's a guy named Rosenzweig who accidentally kills a woman and decides that rather than dispose of the body properly in New York, where he lives, that it's a better idea to take the body, put it into a trunk, and mail it to Chicago. Then there's Pesach Rubinstein, who decides to murder his housekeeper slash cousin slash lover because he got her pregnant and he found out that his real wife is on her way to New York from Poland. There's also the 1929 beauty pageant in Warsaw to choose the most beautiful Jewess in Poland that erupts in scandal and engulfs all of Jewish Warsaw, and which finally devolves into a giant brawl at a funeral during which people screamed and beat each other with blocks of wood as the body of a well-known rabbi was lowered into the ground. It's really just another day in Yiddish land. Jewish history, like most other history, is largely about elites. Rabbis, scholars, writers, politicians, business people, and their ilk rightly fill the rosters of our history books. There's also been a more recent focus on social history, but that also tends to have an upwardly mobile trajectory. Yes, there are a lot of Jewish success stories, but what about the downwardly mobile? What about the failures? Where are the blockheads, the bunglers, or just the plain strange in our history? The reality is that marginal figures do not appear very often in Jewish history books. Scholars haven't taken much interest in Jewish sideshow performers, professional wrestlers, or pickpockets. But Yiddish journalists took an interest, and their stories fill up Yiddish daily newspapers, the first form of mass media among Jews, and one of the only places you'll find Jews of all kinds, from brilliant scientists to circus freaks, from rabbis and scholars to tattoo artists and drag queens. The best and worst of everything appear on the same inky pages, sandwiched together with announcements for public debates on the existence of God and advertisements for post-Passover constipation products. These, among millions of things you've never heard of, appear in the Yiddish Press. And one of the odd things about the Yiddish Press is the way it got started. And one might think that there would have been dozens of Yiddish newspapers in 19th century Eastern Europe, which held the largest Jewish population in the world, about 4 to 5 million Jews, and the vast majority of whom used Yiddish as their vernacular. This region, known as the Pale of Settlement, was controlled by the Russian government and was the area to which they restricted their empire's Jews. Under Russian rule, Jews were not permitted to own land. They were limited to certain kinds of occupations and were forced to pay special taxes, among other issues that made their lives difficult and oppressive. It goes without saying that a free press in Yiddish or in any other language in the empire was a complete impossibility. But when Tsar Alexander II assumed the throne in 1855, things began to change. In addition to freeing the serfs, he changed some of the legislation surrounding Jewish life and allowed the Jews a bit more freedom. Some Jews involved in the Haskalah, or what is known as the Jewish Enlightenment movement, saw this as an opportunity to educate great masses of Jews, and the easiest way to do so would be by publishing newspapers. And they had already seen newspapers in Russian and German, and thought it would be a fine idea to do the same for the large Jewish population. A wealthy Odessa-based women's wear manufacturer by the name of Alexander Cederboim thought it would be a good idea to publish a newspaper to educate all these Jewish readers. And with his government connections, he obtained permission to publish a weekly in Hebrew called Hamelitz. And this is it. So why publish a newspaper in Hebrew for 4 to 5 million Yiddish speakers? Why Hebrew, a liturgical language that no one spoke at the time? Hebrew had become the literary language of a small intellectual elite of which Cederboim was a member. The choice of Hebrew also reflected the attitude of this Jewish elite toward Yiddish, which was really the language of the common people. This attitude was almost uniformly negative. The elite thought that Yiddish was a deformed language and its speakers incapable of intelligent thought. And when Cederboim launched this Hebrew paper in 1860, he wound up with about 150 subscribers. So in a population of millions, it's pretty shabby. Not a good result. And because his motivation, though, was to educate common Jews, he realized, or was made to realize, that he would have to do this in Yiddish. That any sort of mass media he would have to create would have to be in Yiddish. So in 1862, he launched another newspaper called Kol Mavasser. This is it. And I could just point out that this is the first issue of this newspaper. The very first article is about, this was published in October 1862. The first page article is about the American Civil War. And what's interesting about this is that this is in the 1860s. It precedes the mass emigration to America. You have to ask, what do Eastern European Jews even know about America? And this, in a lot of cases, is their first introduction to this new place. And in fact, the way the article reads is almost kind of very naive. It says, we don't know much about this new country, America, but it's something called a republic. They don't have a king, and it's run by businessmen. Now, apparently it's still run by businessmen. I don't think it's working out. It's another matter. Sorry. But it's interesting to see their take on this issue, and their basic sensibility is this seems like a new country where they don't care if you're Jewish or Christian. They just want you to succeed in business, and we hope that they stop fighting this war soon. So things will get better. It's a very naive sensibility. But this newspaper would come to be extremely important in Jewish cultural life in the 19th century. It became the cradle for modern Yiddish literature. They serialized novels in installments in this newspaper. And these were sort of biting social satires written by authors of outstanding quality that appeared each week. Readers clamored for this material, and there were some instances where they didn't publish the next chapter in the following issue. Readers would write in complaining, saying, "Where's the next installment of this novel? We want to see it." Also, it and perhaps more importantly, it brought all kinds of information of the world at large to Jews in small Städtlach, in these towns that Jews lived in. They didn't know much about the wider world, and so this was one way that news of this world was able to enter. And I can give you one small example. In the third issue, which appeared on November 4th, 1862, there's an article, and as I said, one of the purposes of this newspaper was to educate people, and in a lot of cases they translated material that had appeared in either Russian or German about history, about science, about all kinds of things. So on November 4th, 1862, an article appears about the giant sequoia trees in California. And it describes trees that they say are 8,000 to 10,000 years old. They're tall. They have to describe them as being tallest than the tallest tower you've ever seen, and wider than the widest house you've ever seen. And about a month later, a letter appears in the paper saying, "Dear editor, I have to tell you how much I enjoy your newspaper, and I particularly enjoyed this article about the giant sequoia trees in California. But how can a tree be 8,000 to 10,000 years old when the world itself is only 5,623 years old?" And in a nutshell, this episode explains the small breadth of knowledge of Jews in the shtetl and the way that the newspaper completely explodes their worldviews. It's really an incredible phenomenon. And so essentially, Yiddish newspapers were very much responsible for helping make Jews modern. Yiddish newspapers taught Jews all about the world around them. They served as guides to their new lives in big cities or in new countries. It was the only form of mass media available to them. These papers filled Jews with information about the world, about local affairs, and it taught them how to survive in all kinds of new environments. And I just want to show a couple of examples. This is and there are, I'll show you a little bit later, but there are dozens and dozens and dozens of different Yiddish newspapers. This is the first issue of the Vorwärts, which was the most popular, most successful Yiddish newspaper in history. In the late teens, it was founded in New York in 1897. In the late teens, its print run was about 250,000, but its actual circulation was upwards of 1 million. Because people, when you got a newspaper, you shared it. You shared it with the person who worked next to you. You shared it with a neighbor, a relative. So one newspaper might have three, four different readers. And just to give you an idea, around 1920, the New York Times had a circulation of about 400,000. So the Yiddish Press, incidentally, was the largest foreign language press in the history of the United States. And in the 1920s, there were 5 Yiddish dailies in New York City, just to give you an idea of how very big this was. So this is the first front page of the first issue of the Forverts. I'll just point out one thing. It's from April 25th, I think, April 24th, 1867. One of these articles on the front page, one of these main articles, talks about how since the Jews have moved in en masse to the Lower East Side and have supplanted the Irish, all of the Irish pubs that had been on the corners have disappeared. What replaced them? Venture a guess. Delis? No. Butcher shops? No. What do Jews really need? Synagogues? No. They need them, but not as much as they need this. Pharmacies. Jews need pharmacies. Come on. Think about it. Okay, so there are a couple other things I'll show you. This is one of the Forvert's most popular columns was this one. It's called a Bintel Brief, which means a bundle of letters. And it was its agony aunt advice column, and it gave all kinds of advice for all kinds of things. I live with my girlfriend. I'm a modern person, but we're both socialists. But our parents are driving us crazy because they want us to get married. They think it's an offense against God, which we don't believe in. But and so the editors say, you should make your parents happy and get married. They're very sort of even-handed about these things. They're all, there are letters about how. My wife has become a communist. I'm a socialist. We now disagree politically. We're having enormous fights. The kids are upset. How do we handle this problem? And it's all kinds of questions like that. Most of them are love related, but there are all kinds of social issues that are addressed as well. And it's really kind of an interesting purview into Jewish life of the period. Another popular column was this one. This is called a Galeria von verschwundenen Männer, or a Gallery of Missing Men. This is a little known aspect of Jewish history. In the early part of the 20th century, Jewish men abandoning their families was an epidemic. And so much so that this newspaper created a daily column to which women and families would send photos of their husbands who had run off and descriptions of them so that people could find them. This problem was so serious that a quasi-governmental agency was created called the National Desertion Bureau that actively sought to find these men and bring them to justice in order to pay for their families. It was a huge problem, and it's an aspect of Jewish history that's really very little known. It was so serious that, and so widespread that not only did newspapers deal with this issue, and not only were agencies created to deal with it, but local psychics also dealt with it. This is an advertisement from a Lower East Side psychic by the name of Professor Abraham Hochman, whose specialty was finding missing husbands. So you could see sort of how widespread this kind of thing is. Additionally, one of the things I mentioned is that the Yiddish Press really functioned very much as a guide to life in the New World for immigrants. It taught them how to vote. It taught them how to, and these were people coming to the country who had never voted before. It taught them how to, whether to join a union, if that was good. It taught them how to buy a pair of shoes without getting ripped off, or how to avoid getting pickpocketed on the Lower East Side. It also taught them, as you see here, how to play baseball. This is an article in Yiddish on how to play baseball. I don't think they thought that Jewish immigrants would have time or the interest to actually play baseball, but they understood that it was an aspect of American life that they needed to know about in order to become Americans, and also that their children would be playing, and that in order to participate in their children's lives, they needed to know what this thing was. Very quickly, I'll just show you some of the other newspapers that existed. This is the Wahrheit, which was a Zionist socialist newspaper. This is the Morgenjournal, considered an Orthodox newspaper. This is Der Tag, a more intellectual, considered sort of the New York Times of the Yiddish papers. This is the Freiheit, the communist newspaper. And then there are all kinds of other monthlies, weeklies. There's a huge variety of things that there's really something for everyone. So here's a women's magazine, magazine for Jewish farmers. Not that well known. Lots of Jewish chicken farmers in New Jersey and dairy farmers in the Catskills. They needed information on farming in their own language. Yiddish poetry journal, arts and literature. Humor magazines, political humor magazines. These were sort of like, I guess, the Daily Show or the Onion in Yiddish. Politics and literature. Very dogmatic, excellent art, but very dogmatic communist ideology. Vegetarian Monthly. Vegetarianism is not new. It's not new at all. Theater magazine. Now, also, these are everything that I just showed you, and there are dozens more, really. Everything that I just showed you is from New York. In Eastern Europe, you also had the same phenomenon, but because the Russian government controlled all of these things until 1917, it was very much restricted. So, for example, this is the first Yiddish daily, which was only permitted in 1903 out of St. Petersburg. It eventually moved to Warsaw because Warsaw became the center of culture, the center of Yiddish culture in Eastern Europe. This is Heint, a Zionist daily, which would become the most popular newspaper in Poland in the interwar period, but it started in 1908. This is Moment, another popular. It was originally run by an organization called the Folkists, who were sort of a folk-based, pro-Yiddish language-based political party. In addition to things like this, you had Literarische Blätter, which was kind of like the New York Review of Books of Yiddish. This is a literary weekly. You have Orthodox or magazines for Orthodox youth that contain literature and all kinds of things. You have magazines for Jewish atheists. This is the Freidenker, the Freethinker. You have Der Jiddische Emigrant, magazine for people who are in the process of emigration. There's all kinds of information that you need to know if you're emigrating, and this was how you got it. There's no internet at this time. It's like media wise, it's a very, very different landscape. There are sports newspapers. This is the Sportzeitung. This is a sports weekly from Warsaw. This is a health magazine called Volksgesund, the People's Health. This contained articles like this: "Don't spit on the floor." Something that everyone should really know. There's also a huge humor magazine industry in Poland. There are dozens and dozens of different humor magazines with all kinds of cartoons and parodies and satires and all kinds of things like that. It's really the field of this Yiddish world of periodicals is really pretty amazing. So now the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the late 19th and early 20th century heyday of the Yiddish press can be seen as kind of a disjointed chronicle of Jewish urban life that tells us stories about our past that cannot be found anywhere else. While we'll never have anything close to a complete picture of the Yiddish world that was, dredging up just a little enriches our sense of it because it reveals how much we do not know. The Yiddish press contains an enormous amount of data on Jewish life of the period, ranging from politics to literature to theater to religion and daily life. And these are the things that one usually remembers that daily newspapers have. Now, when I began to find all kinds of strange stories about Jewish bunglers, blockheads, and oddballs, I realized that no one had explored this avenue of Jewish life, and that at some level it was important that these people become part of the historical record. These forgotten stories offer a look at the seamy underbelly of Jewish urban life, a peek into the depths of Jewish poverty and insanity, into the frequently troubled world of migrants in big cities, where any misstep is potential disaster and therefore also potentially news. So you have to ask, what is the historical value of stories of the Yiddish lowlife? Since they're clearly not representative of Jewry at large, what do they reveal? In every society, there is some level of the populace that is considered by those who do the record keeping lowly, uncultured, uneducated, poor, dangerous, frightening, ugly, and worthy of attention really from only a safe distance. And yet, even from a protracted historical distance, these Jews are incredibly interesting and have something to say about themselves. They are easily stereotyped, yet they break the molds in which they're supposed to fit. These Jews that we find in the Yiddish press are secular, they're religious, and they're a little bit of both. They are a complex mix of shtetl folklore and urban poverty. Yiddish-speaking city dwellers they were often incredibly modern and yet sometimes backward and dumb. In short, they're kind of like everyone else. But most of all, they're not the Jews you expected when you heard the word Yiddish. Now, one of the things I want to do is talk about some of the ways in which I fell into this project. This book was essentially an accident. I did not go looking for these stories, but stumbled upon them during the course of doing research on other things. So when I was in graduate school, a friend of mine who worked in the rare book room of the Jewish Theological Seminary Library asked me if I would take a look at a strange newspaper that he had found. It was uncatalogued and undated. It was not typeset, but handwritten and lithographed. And what's more, it had a number of gruesome images on it, including a murder scene and another of the police showing a frightened man, a dead body in a morgue. And this is it. And it turned out to be from 1876. And this is before this great emigration in the 1880s. Now, I had never seen a Yiddish newspaper that looked like this. And so I was very intrigued. I read the text, which turned out to be the story of a man named Pesach Rubinstein, who I mentioned earlier, who had allegedly murdered his cousin, lover, housekeeper after getting her pregnant and discovering that his own wife was on her way over to the United States from Poland. I'd never heard of this unusual case and began to look at it through the indexes of a Jewish American history text to see what I could find. And I was very surprised to barely find anything. I found 3 indexes that had attached to text that mentioned this story. One of the books had a sentence about it. Another had a paragraph, and another had a bit more than a page on this episode. And this would turn out to be incredibly surprising because when I began to look in the American English language press for information about this story, what I discovered was that not only was this front page news in every New York City newspaper, but virtually every newspaper in America wrote about this story. It was a huge, absolutely huge case. And what was amazing to me was that historians had essentially ignored it. And what was amazing to me was that I found that it was really the biggest interface between Jews and American media in the country up to that point. So, and the case was an absolute media sensation. After it ended, 4 illustrated pulp pamphlets were printed, as was the entire trial transcript, which was sold as a popular book when the case was over. That was relatively unusual. Not only that, there were songs that were written about Pesach Rubinstein, popular songs that people sang. About 40 years later, in an article that was a retrospective of Jewish life on the Lower East Side, this is an article that came out in the Vorwärts in 1910, there was mention of the Rubinstein case as a seminal event in the history of the Jewish settlement on the Lower East Side. And so I found it amazing that this case was completely ignored until I stumbled across it because this friend of mine gave me this newspaper to translate. So, and this is one of the chapters in the book. Another way in which I stumbled across some of this material was thanks to cartoons. Rabbi Lustig mentioned that my dissertation was on cartoons of the Yiddish press, and so I spent a great deal of time researching Yiddish newspapers on microfilm, looking for these cartoons. Once in a while, I would come across a cartoon that had figures or characters in it that I did not recognize. And that was not that uncommon. But there was a case in the spring of 1929 where I began to see cartoons that featured a young woman with straight black hair, ample cleavage, and a unibrow. And this is her. I'll just show you a couple more. of who she was. So I had never seen this person. I didn't know. I when I first saw these cartoons, I didn't know who she was or who the people surrounding were, and I didn't know what the story was. She was marked as someone called Miss Judea. I didn't know what that was. I'd never heard of that. So it turned out that she was the winner of a beauty pageant called the Miss Judea pageant, which was held in 1929 to choose the most beautiful girl in Poland. It was a publicity stunt created by a Polish language Jewish newspaper, in part because they figured that a Jewish girl would never win the Miss Poland contest. So what they did was they put out an open call for contestants, and they were flooded with hundreds of photographs, which they published in their weekly photo magazine. After printing about 6 weeks of photographs, they asked the readers to fill out a form to choose their top 10 candidates. Which they did. The top 10 finalists took part in a gala pageant at the posh Hotel Polonia in Warsaw. Now, this pageant generated a lot of press, although the Yiddish press generally gave the impression that the whole thing was a ridiculous affair, that it was a waste of time. Now, in the end, the woman who won, and this is her in cartoon form, and I can show you her here in real life, and this is her on the cover of the illustrated supplement to the Jewish Polish language newspaper. Her name was Sofia Oldak. And after winning, she was brought around to all the Jewish celebrities and politicians and institutions for photo ops. It was a media event. So in addition to that, she was invited to the Warsaw Jewish Community Council, which was a quasi-governmental institution that governed Jewish affairs. She was invited there for a sumptuous banquet at which the council's president stood up, praised her beauty, and sang her the biblical Song of Songs, which is sort of an erotic poem in the middle of the Bible. Now, I guess according to today's standards, this is not particularly egregious. But at the time, the ultra-Orthodox political parties, who were also council members, were absolutely furious at what they perceived to be a desecration not only of the community council, but also of the Song of Songs. So furious were they that they immediately brought all the boys out of their yeshivas to protest in front of the Jewish Community Council building. The newspaper that ran the pageant brought out secular Jews to protest on the other side of the street. And the Polish police were in between, wondering what is going on with these Jews. Now, after about a week, these protests died down. And unconnected to any of it, the vice president of the community council, a man by the name of Yeshaya Rosenboim, passed away. He was also the president of the ultra-Orthodox political party. He was old. It had nothing to do with the events at hand. Now, what this meant was that sort of a state funeral would have to be held. I mean, you have to remember that there are about 350,000 Jews live in Warsaw. It's a huge population, and what was essentially a state funeral had to be held. They expected 15 to 20,000 people, and the president of the Warsaw Community Council, who had a week previous been involved in all these Miss Judea shenanigans, had to give a eulogy in the name of the council because that's his job. So now the council president, a Zionist politician by the name of Heschel Farbstein, was so nervous that he decided that it would be best if he went to the deceased's family and requested permission to speak. They said, yes, you should absolutely speak. This is not a political matter. This is a funeral, and this is not about politics. They insisted that he speak. But when he arrived at the funeral, which was attended mostly by Hasidim, probably about 50, as I said, 50 to 20,000 of them, the crowd was already hot. And when they saw the president, when they saw Farbstein, they began booing and hissing. He quickly understood that he would not be able to give this eulogy, and he was hustled out of the cemetery to great applause. But the crowd, particularly the yeshiva bochers, the yeshiva boys, were very excited, and people began arguing over whether or not Farbstein should have been allowed to stay or whether or not he should have been kicked out. These disputes turned into shoving matches, which became fistfights. Soon, hats were flying and canes were swinging all over the place. And as an esteemed Warsaw rabbi was lowered into his grave to his eternal rest, people screamed and beat each other around his grave. It was a major scandal. And obviously, this is a short version of this. But the point is, just by looking at old cartoons, I accidentally dredged up an incredibly fascinating story that dealt with a wide variety of cultural, social, journalistic, religious, and political aspects of Jewish life in Warsaw between the two world wars. A strange event to be sure, but one that reflected really an incredibly vibrant community. And I discovered many such revealing stories just by looking at these cartoons, tales of communal affairs that hadn't been considered by historians, but which complemented traditional historiography by adding a distinctly human element to it. Now, another time, while I was researching cartoons in the Yiddish dailies, I discovered that most of the cartoons really only appeared in the Friday editions. So, and this is funny because when I talk to undergrads about this, I have to explain what newspapers are. They don't read newspapers. They have these small devices that they just sit in bed and everything comes to this little box. And the idea that you would have to leave your house and walk to the corner to get information is like complete anathema to them. It's not comprehensible. So it's something that I do have to explain. I think that I don't have to explain this to anybody here. So the Friday edition of Yiddish newspapers in Warsaw was like the Sunday edition here. It was the big newspaper. It was the heavy edition for weekend reading. So because Jews took Saturday off, their big newspaper was on Friday. It's actually the same thing in Israel today. But here it's obviously on Sunday. And the Yiddish newspapers here also had their big editions on Sunday. But because the funny pages, because the cartoons only appeared in the Friday editions, and because I was only looking for cartoons, I would sit at the microfilm reader and I would flip the dial in order to skip the entire week so I could go from Friday to Friday. Because I didn't need to I knew there were no cartoons in the middle and I didn't need to look at that. So one day I was looking at one of the Yiddish dailies. I think I was in 1929 and I was skipping from Friday to Friday. I was going at a steady clip, copying my cartoons. And I turned the dial and I wound up on the inside of a Thursday paper. But the headline in front of me was "Two Wives, Blazing Punches, and the Cops." And I'm a relatively distracted person. So I saw that headline and I thought, okay, I'll bite. It looks interesting enough. The story turned out to be about a Hasidic man in Warsaw known only as Avram Aleph, who fell in love with his wife's best friend. He married her, set her up in an apartment outside of town, and shuttled between the two women, telling the first wife that he was away on business when he was visiting the second wife. The neighbors of the first wife figured out what was going on. They told his brother, who was known as being fanatically religious. His brother was furious, organized a trial at the Warsaw Rabbinical Court, dragged his brother there. When he and his brother arrived, there was a panel of 3 rabbis waiting. Both wives were there, and about 30 members of the first wife's family were also there waiting. Incidentally, mostly women, the newspaper report mentions. So they held the trial. The verdict was that Avram had to divorce both women. When the verdict was read, when the rabbis made it official, his brother ran over to him and punched him in the face. The 30 members of the first wife's family attacked the second wife, beating her badly. The rabbis ran out, the police were called, and they arrested everyone. So I sat in front of the microfilm reader, and I was flabbergasted. But I was also transfixed. I thought to myself, my God, what a story. And I began to think to myself, there must be other stories like this. So from that time on, instead of skipping the entire week, I began to scan slowly, looking for headlines of interesting and unusual stories that, that were appealing in this way. And what I eventually discovered was that the rabbinical court was a kind of locus for this type of unruly action. And Yiddish newspaper editors would send journalists to report. It was like court. It was public. Anyone could go, and editors would send journalists to report on these stories because they knew there was always something juicy unfolding before the rabbis. And in fact, it's known that Isaac Bashevis Singer and also his older brother Israel Joshua Singer were both sent and both reported from these courts. And if you look, particularly in the works of Bashevis Singer, his book From My Father's Court has sort of veiled references to characters in some of these stories. So there's also a connection to Jewish literature as well. And I just like to read you a couple of these stories just so you can get an idea of what this world was. Now, this one is from 1928. It's the headline was Krachmolna Amcho throws punches in the rabbinate. Now, this requires a little bit of explanation. Krachmolna was the name of a street in Warsaw, actually on which Isaac Bashevis Singer spent part of his childhood. And if you read it in My Father's Court, there's actually a great deal about this street, which was very poor. A lot of criminals and sort of working class families lived on it. And it also had a lot of characters. Now, Amcho literally means your children, and it refers to God's children. But in Yiddish and also in Hebrew slang, it means the common rabble. It's average, daily, uneducated, poor Jews. And it's used ironically. So Krachmolna Amcho means sort of like the common rabble of Krachmolna Street. And the article reads like this. On Wednesday, the rabbinate heard a case from Krachmolna Street. The bride and groom showed up with about 15 people from the real Amcho who came as witnesses. Upon seeing such an army entering the court, Rabbis Richeval, Poisner, and Schoengrass began to tremble and started to look for a door. The bride and groom met about 8 months ago and set and signed conditions for their future marriage and even set specific dates for the event. But the groom doesn't want to go under the chuppah because he says the bride isn't an honest one. So they came to the rabbi to get a judgment. The rabbi asks, "What do you mean by not honest?" "I'm certain that she already has a child," he answers. Upon hearing the word child, the prospective bride whacked the groom with his fiery slap. The groom didn't want to owe her and paid up with a sizzling reply. The rabbinate filled with screams as turmoil ensued. The witnesses also began fighting, and when the rabbi saw what was coming, they slowly crept out. Once again, the the assistant had to run out and get a policeman. By the time the policeman arrived, things had already calmed down. Both sides turned to the rabbinical assistant and asked him to convince the other rabbis to consider the case, that earlier they'd been agitated and that they won't brawl anymore. But it didn't help. "You can't fight in the rabbinate. You'll have to come another time," he told them. The group went away with the intention of returning. Krachmolna doesn't know any tricks. Either get married or don't. Just don't hassle a Jewish girl. Here's another one. This is from 1934. And there are hundreds of these stories. In fact, I'll say there's a chapter of these stories in the book. I had to cut it in half. I could have just done a book of this. The stories are just endless. All right, so this one is from 1934. The headline is "A Hot and Bloody Day in the Rabbinate." Yesterday in the rabbinate was a hot one, and bloody too. Good sense was butchered, and the blood flowed like water. And rest assured that the rabbis ran out in the middle of these cases. The poor rabbis. All of the disputes broke out in connection with divorce proceedings, which unfortunately have occurred all too often as of late. The first fight occurred between the owner of the Garden Restaurant, 45-year-old Masha Becker, and her second husband, 25-year-old Yitzchak Lerner, an employee in her restaurant. 5 years ago, Becker's first husband died, and she took Lerner the waiter as her husband. But in the restaurant, she still treated him like a servant. Lerner refused to put up with that and called his wife to the rabbinate and asked to have her sign the business over to him. Words were exchanged, and Lerner slapped his wife. That didn't seem to bother her at all, and she blackened his face with the contents of an inkwell. No agreement was reached. A second couple beat each other up over a heated issue. A certain Label Nyman was a frequent guest at his fiancée's house, where he would come to eat and occasionally sleep over until his fiancée wound up with a bun in the oven. But in front of the rabbi, he said he didn't know anything about it. What? The girl screamed. Now you don't know anything? Here, now you'll know something. And she punched him in the mouth so hard that she knocked out 2 of his teeth, and he was completely soaked in blood. A third case did not even make it into the courtroom. It played out in the hallway. A young man with 4 women, 2 wives and 2 brides, showed up in the hall. They pounded one another so badly before the trial that the police had to be called, who were able to pull the combatants apart only after great effort. What a hot day it was yesterday in the rabbinate. So one of the funny things in a kind of reverse situation, after finding stories like this about activities in the Warsaw rabbinate, I began to find cartoons about them. So these are just some of examples. If the text is too small to read, I'll read them. This is a cartoon that's called New Furniture in the Rabbinate, and the shamus, or the assistant, says, it's a shame to bring that stuff in. It will all be smashed. After one case, it's kaput. This is called Readied for Destruction. And it says, what's going on here? Another community council meeting? It says, no, it's a divorce case in the rabbinate. This is at the rabbinate. I heard they're having a wrestling match here. I came to buy a ticket. Gas masks as a security measure in the rabbinate. Now we can begin the case. Call in the appellants. This just gives you an idea of what was going on. This is another similar one. Protected from getting punched in a brawl. New, we can start. Call in the couple who wants a divorce. We're fully protected. So this gives an idea of what type of activities were taking place here, and that this was in full public knowledge. This was part of contemporary Jewish life in Warsaw between the 2 world wars. And in fact, the shamus that's made reference to, or the synagogue assistant, was actually famous in Warsaw. His name was Rabbi Volkenbright, and he was famous for mediating between couples in order that they not go before the rabbis. He did sort of a pre-mediation in order to avoid bringing these people before the rabbis. And there are cartoons that show this man, Reb Don Volkenbright, going to the League of Nations, saying only Reb Don can solve these crises. He was famous as a mediator. Now, these stories appear in Yiddish newspapers worldwide. So they're, in my travels in these papers, I found similar stories in New York as well. So just as an example, and what I like about this particular example is it's very reflective of the kind of permanent state of Jewish communal affairs. And I think you may know what I'm talking about after I read it. And this is from September 1907. Yom Kippur services in a Clinton Street hall were disrupted due to a fight over a chair. When Joseph Rand showed up in a shul with his family, when Joseph Rand showed up in shul with his family, he discovered that one Herman Garber was sitting in one of the seats he had reserved. Rand informed Garber that he was in one of his seats, but Garber produced a ticket indicating that Rand was wrong and that, in fact, it was his seat. Rand responded by punching Garber in the face. Not to be outdone, Garber tore out part of Rand's beard. The lion-like voice of the cantor was drowned out by the screams and howls of the fighting congregants. In the end, both Rand and Garber were forced to finish the Musaf service in the Essex Market Court, where they were both held under arrest. I can only imagine that it's just like that here. Just another example from the New York Yiddish Press. This is from March 1913. 18-year-old Esther Goldberg, a pretty girl who lives at 20 Pitt Street on the Lower East Side, went out early in the morning to the grocery store to get some rolls for breakfast. Suddenly, she saw her neighbor, a young tailor by the name of Harris Bloom, who was coming home late from a dance, getting attacked by a thief, who popped Bloom so hard in the head he couldn't see straight. The thief grabbed Bloom's money and took off running. Miss Goldberg, a Cossack of a girl, however, gave chase. She caught up with the thief on Grand Street and punched him so hard he went tumbling down. With that, she jumped on top of him and pounded him so hard with her fist until he saw stars. The robber was only saved because the police showed up and took him to jail. End of story. And there are legion, myriad stories like this of Jewish immigrant life in Warsaw, on the Lower East Side, wherever Jews wound up. Now, when families get together and talk about their immigrant forebears, about their bubbies and their zadies, these are not usually the stories they tell. You never hear stories like this. But these stories are nonetheless part of history. And unsavory as some of them may be, they're still part of a larger Jewish story. This book, Bad Rabbi, is a small attempt to retrieve some of the flotsam and jetsam of Yiddish land, the stories of the Jewish two-bit nobodies who would have otherwise been completely forgotten. Thank you.
It's the Veterinary Institute I was thinking of.
Okay.
So we want to thank you, and it is quite interesting, and we'll take a moment. I believe this morning we're going to pass out cards for questions, and if you want to write a question, please just raise your hand and we'll do that, and then we'll continue on. What you gave great voice to and is so wonderful, and I hope that you'll share a little bit more of, is that you do carry us through this development of Jewish identity and the changes that take through, and the broadness and richness of Jewish culture in its heyday, and we look forward to hearing those comments. We're very privileged at Washington Hebrew Congregation to have as chair of our Amram Scholar Series Leslie Maitland, an author herself, and worked for that, as you described, that shabby institute, the New York Times at one point, which brought her to Washington. She's landed with us and has been running our Scholar Series, and I invite Leslie to thank her for bringing us this interesting topic and to share with us what's coming up. Leslie?
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, Eddy Portnoy. That was really terrific. I must say, when I heard you speak at the Jewish Book Council, I thought, we need some laughter this year, and I think you gave it to us. And maybe Jews always needed laughter, and I think that's part of the story. So I hope everyone will pick up our beautiful postcards out front, where it gives you a listing of everything that's coming up. But to give everyone a chance to write out some questions for Rabbi Lustig to ask our scholar today, I'll just tell you a bit about what's coming up in the next couple of weeks and months. So next we have a bit more serious topic with Amherst professor William Taubman, whose biography of Khrushchev won a Pulitzer Prize. He'll be here on January 28th to discuss his new biography, Mikhail Gorbachev, His Life and Times. He tells a fascinating story of how Gorbachev, a peasant boy, rose to lead one of the world's superpowers and then dismantled the Soviet system with the acquiescence of the communist regime. His personal portrait relies on interviews with Gorbachev himself, so it's very interesting. On April 15th, we'll have Francine Klagsbrunn, and I should say both of these books recently got great reviews in the Times. She'll be here to talk about another world historical figure, Golda Meir, the subject of her new biography entitled Lioness. Born in Russia, Meir emigrated to America in 1906, grew up in Milwaukee, and went on to become the iron-willed fourth Prime Minister of Israel. Before Passover, another funny speaker, we'll have Alan Zweibel, a 5-time Emmy Award-winning writer for Saturday Night Live, and to Curb Your Enthusiasm, who will share his funny take on Pesach and the Exodus. He'll be talking about his new book entitled For This We Left Egypt, a Passover Haggadah for Jews and those who love them. And I guess you can really tell my mood this year that I needed still more humor because on May 6th, we have another author who's also, I just found out, well reviewed in today's New York Times Book Review, Professor Jeremy Dauber of Columbia and Michael Krasny will close the season with a scholarly but witty examination of the special nature of Jewish humor. They are the authors of Jewish Comedy, A Serious History, and Let There Be Laughter, and they will discuss the comedic archetypes of Jewish culture and the masters of Jewish comedy, such as the Marx Brothers, Woody Allen, Joan Rivers, Philip Roth, Sarah Silverman, Jon Stewart. What's so funny, they ask, about Jewish suffering and struggles for survival? Now, if I may just start off with one little question of my own, I'd like to ask you whether the comics that you found, do they prefigure in any way the kind of anti-Semitic caricatures that Der Stürmer would, popularize in anti-Semitic newspapers at the time in Germany?
So the characters in the Yiddish press often make use of when people who are unfamiliar with them see Yiddish cartoons, they often think that they look like anti-Semitic caricatures. They really don't. If you make and cartoons in the Yiddish press exist from the 1880s, but don't really get going until the first decade of the 20th century. Anti-Semitic caricature, it prefigures this. It goes back many centuries. But these particular cartooning is a form of visual shorthand, and they needed to draw Jews who looked like Jews. The framework and visual dynamic of caricaturing Jews had already been anti-Semitic caricature that existed prior to Yiddish cartoonists starting their craft. And they essentially took those ideas and worked with them. But if you compare an anti-Semitic caricature from Der Stürmer and a cartoon from the Yiddish press, it's completely different. The visual shorthand that they use, for instance, in the Yiddish press, is whenever they want to draw a cartoon of someone just to represent a Jewish person, let's say a man, it's always someone who's like Hasidic, a long black coat, beard, hat. This is the visual shorthand that they wanted to use. Sometimes they have big noses, sometimes they don't. The difference is that within the context of the Yiddish press, there's no anti-Semitism. It's all completely pro-Jewish. Whereas in something like Der Stürmer or the anti-Semitic press, it's the diametric opposite. It's the whole purpose of that is to negate the Jews and sort of do any kind of damage they can visually and otherwise. So the context is really required in order to understand what these two types of visuals.
So that'll lead into another question that we have here. In your, you make a comment several times through in the book about how Yiddish is used today, often almost in a denigrating way, that really limits the image of the Jew or limits the image of what the Jew was in the great time of the Pale. And I'd like you to speak a little bit about that, the comment, and I believe in one place you talked about often that they'll pull a Yiddish song to that's sad and demure and
right.
In this sense, and creating this sense. So how is it that somebody has co-opted, if you will, this Yiddish, the view of the Jew through using some of these stereotypes? And also, there was a question, and would you speak a little bit about your introduction to the book, which really, you talk about the importance and the history, and why did you start the book, which is a humorous book about with this concept of the importance of Yiddish and Yiddish history.
Right. So the nature of the popular perception of Yiddish today is very much a stereotype. In movies, you'll see if it's, typically they'll show older people speaking Yiddish. If it's, a historical scene and it's younger people, they'll play the lullaby often Pripyachuk. They're all, everyone's religious. There are all kinds of stereotypes associated with Yiddish and what it's supposed to be. Some people say that Yiddish is funny. I don't think that's accurate. In fact, I say in the book that it's not Yiddish that's funny, it's its speakers who are funny. A language in and of itself is just a tool. It's not, it's not inherently humorous. But the situation of the Jews in Eastern Europe and elsewhere as an oppressed or impoverished minority, required them to handle the situation. And one of the ways they handled it was in humorous ways. So this is one of the stereotypes that exists, and it's just become very common. So one of the things, there are many ways to do this. The reality of Yiddish life and Yiddish cultural life was that it was just as broad as any other culture. You have everything in Yiddish. In my book, I talk about sort of the seamy underbelly. I talk about criminals and things like that. But you have all kinds of high culture, incredibly brilliant expressionist poetry. You have opera. You have incredible theater. Arts. Anything you can imagine existed in Yiddish. It's just that once you trade one language for another, as the generations go by, knowledge of this language disappears and certain, archetypes of it remain. And, these archetypes of, humor, sadness, kind of a lachrymose environment has been what's remained. And one of the things I've tried to do in my book is just bring out another aspect of this world that people are not familiar with in order to expand people's sensibilities of what it could be.
So there's a question here. How do you think future scholars will view some of the Jewish unsavories of today, Bernie Madoff, Harry Weinstein, and others? What do their actions indicate about Jewish life today?
That's an interesting question. Now, one of the aspects of this, of the people that I've worked on, is that they were Jewish in a different way. They spoke Yiddish, which is an intensely Jewish language. They were culturally very, their culture, actually, their cardinal culture, their primary culture was Jewish. Their primary culture was Yiddish. So in that respect, it's a different framework. So, and also because these things happened about 100 years ago, there's something that a lot of people say that tragedy plus time equals comedy. So that's one of the reasons that these stories can appear funny. Just looking at them on their own, murder stories and stories of criminals are not necessarily funny. But the way that they were reported and the way that they appear to us historically can be. So that's important. Now, as far as the Jewish criminals that exist today, I don't think that they'll be viewed in the same way because culturally they are much more American than they are Jewish. And that is yet a different framework. There's nothing, other than his name, really, someone like Harvey Weinstein is not, there's nothing about what he did. There's no Jewish component to it. If there's, for instance, one of the last stories I read over a fight in a chair on Yom Kippur, that's not what this is about. That's a Jewish story. These stories are not, there's nothing Jewish about them.
I want to push you a little more on this because in your, I believe it's the first vignette, I don't remember which one, but the vignette that you talk about the abortionist and the trunk and all
right.
things, you point out in that vignette that nowhere in the coverage of that did anybody make a fact that the person was Jewish.
Right.
It was simply that. And so you track through the book in terms of this, in some of your commentary, a transformation of Jewish identity from, if you will, the other that was particularistic in its thing to becoming the other that was, its particularism leads to universalism, but How do you see the transformation of this and that change as you saw these stories move on?
Right. So that story is about the abortionist is an anomaly. It's interesting because it's very early on. It takes place in 1871. There are not a lot of Jews in the United States. And I think that the press doesn't really know, they've never dealt with a case that has this kind of cultural and religious minority as its central figure. And so they essentially leave it alone. It's not, they don't touch it. They don't deal with the Jewish issue. It's not part, it's known that he's Jewish, but it's not part of the commentary. 5 years later, when the Pesach Rubinstein trial takes place, the Jewish question becomes much more important, in part because of the Jews themselves. What happens is Pesach Rubinstein is a Jew from Poland. He's a Yiddish-speaking Jew. He's deeply religious, and he has long payas and wears a long black coat and wears a hat, has a long beard. What happens is articles begin appearing in the English language press that are planted by German Jews who have already assimilated into the country's culture. And what they do is they say, these Polish Jews are savages. They're not like us, who we're Americans. We're like everybody else. So there's this really interesting differentiation. And this is a theme that happens over and over again with not just Jews, but all kinds of immigrants, where the previous generations of immigrants differentiate themselves by playing themselves off against newcomers. And this happens today. It's not anything new. And this happens throughout Jewish life. One of the interesting aspects of Jewish popular culture from just after the turn of the 20th century is you have this phenomenon in vaudeville, and obviously everyone is familiar with minstrelsy, with blackface. It's not that well known that there was also something called Jewface, where Gentile actors would put on putty noses and beards and hats and would play a kind of stage Jew. And it was very offensive. And they did this with all ethnic groups. Blackface was the most popular, but they did stage Italians, they did Chinese, everyone was taken. They did the Irish. Everyone was taken to task. And but what's interesting about the Jewish aspect to this is that when Jews started seeing this on stage in vaudeville theaters, they said, you know what? We can do a much better job making fun of ourselves than they can. So they took it over, and they started performing in Jewface. And there are dozens and dozens of songs, some of which were written by people like Irving Berlin, that are like, I mean, today they're completely offensive. That Irving Berlin wrote a song called "Cohen Owes Me $97." I mean, but this was part of culture. And this was part of, previous generations of immigrants differentiating themselves against newer immigrants. They could go to these performances and see these bumbling stage Jews and say, that's not me. I don't have that accent anymore. I don't dress like that anymore. I'm an American now. And so this, it's all part of this process. And it was a continual process. It's like, it doesn't happen with Jews so much anymore, but with all kinds of different immigrant groups, it still occurs.
So I want to follow this a little bit more because there's two things that you talk about: the broadness of Yiddish culture. You talk about that there was nothing that was in life that was not in the Yiddish language, and so the medium for just daily life was being chronicled in these Yiddish papers.
Right.
But at the same time, you talk about that many of the things in the stories that you looked at, that there was a particularism because the particular people in them were Jews and living Jewish lives.
Right.
So at the same time, does that become the medium by which we build stereotypes for the Jew, or in others because? Well,
I mean, stereotypes, happen for a variety of reasons, but the problem with stereotypes is that while there's always a kernel of truth in them, generally, on a much broader scale, they're not accurate. but they wouldn't be understandable if there weren't a kernel of truth. So, just as an example, the anti-Semitic caricature with Jews with big noses, if Jews with big noses didn't exist, those wouldn't be recognizable.
But were these things in the Yiddish press okay to put in the Yiddish press because they weren't Shanda Lagoyim? Because
Yes. Yes.
they were in Yiddish. And
Right. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is that the Yiddish press functioned as kind of a private conversation among Jews. No one else. There were plenty of Gentiles who could speak Yiddish because they worked with Jews and they learned the language just by working with them, but they generally didn't read it. And so as a result, the Yiddish press was this private conversation where you could really say anything. And so once you enter once Jews traded Yiddish for English in this country, that conversation became public. And there was an instance a month ago where a writer in Tablet magazine was writing on the Harvey Weinstein debacle and wrote about how Jews are perverted, and likened him to a real life Alexander Portnoy. Unfortunately, this is my last name, but I've lived with it. But Alexander Portnoy was this Philip Roth character who was completely sex obsessed, and this writer likened in an article online, talked about how Jews can be perverted. And the reality is that everybody can be perverted. But David Duke latched onto this and said, you see, they even talk about themselves this way. And so that public conversation is a completely different phenomenon than what existed in Yiddish, where that never would have left the confines of the Yiddish press.
so I want you to talk a little bit about, as somebody who looks at modern popular Jewish culture, who writes in both, the two different generations, the forward and tablet. Where do you see we stand in terms of the role or Jewish identity today? And what role does this history of Yiddish and the Yiddish newspaper and Yiddish itself play at present day and will play in the future, do you believe?
Well, that's a difficult question. So I hate to engage in any sort of punditry about Jewish identity. It's hard to gauge. People have been saying that Jews would have assimilated for the past 200 years. It hasn't really happened. Some Jews do, some Jews don't. They did it then, they do it now. It's an ongoing thing. People have also been saying that Yiddish would disappear for the past 200 years, and it still exists. In fact, today Yiddish is growing because ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic populations have 6 to 10 kids per family, and they all speak Yiddish. Now, it's not the literary Yiddish that exists in the Yiddish press, but it's still Yiddish. And in fact, I personally know of people who have left those communities who are still engaged in Yiddish culture because they like it. They're no longer religious, but they love their culture and they want to continue participating in it. So, in a way, it's impossible to say that something is going to be enhanced, someone's identity is going to be enhanced by this, or they're going to see this and say, I don't want anything to do with this. There's such a wide variation, and it's all kind of a personal preference. People do what they're going to do, and there's no judging on how anything is going to turn out. But as a historical phenomenon, the Jews have muddled through for thousands of years, and I suspect that they're going to continue muddling for, until North Korea and Donald Trump figure something out.
I was fascinated by your the intense humor of the rabbi with the kaporis and the kaporis,
Right.
The chicken that's just supposed to get out all of our sins and it's defecating on the rabbi, this sort of situation goes through. When you went through all of these things, what were some of the most fascinating? I know you have some in the book, but other things that taught you that you thought were just indicated this change, because in what you described, there's certainly been a change in the assimilation of what the American rabbinate is.
Oh, sure.
It is not, the American rabbinate is no longer the adjudication of halakhic issues. It modeled much more the American clergy, and in ways very interesting, it modeled the opportunity, it made a transition to the American clergy taking on that role and yet imbuing in it. Our own example here is that Abram Simon helped create a board of education in the Washington, D.C. area, because they simply didn't have a board of education. And a Baltimore rabbi and a Washington rabbi brought those models to unify schools. What are some of the stories that you show of that you see in some of this change that you see?
Well, I mean, obviously, in regard to I'm dealing with two places in the book. I deal with Warsaw and New York, and the changes are very different in both places. They in New York, you have the upheaval of immigration, and which changes things very drastically. The traditional old world rabbi is not particularly functional in the new world. And so this is realized, and for the up and coming generations, a new sort of modern rabbinate is developed. And, the Hebrew Union College had already been involved in that. In 1902, they sort of they hired Solomon Schechter, who was this Eastern European scholarly rabbi, but who was also very modern, and it was his job to create a modern rabbinate for American Jews. Now, one of the funny things, it's not in the book, but there's a cartoon from 1910 of Solomon Schechter in a Yiddish humor magazine, and it shows him standing at a meat grinder, grinding it in a butcher's apron, and he's putting in Eastern European Jewish yeshiva boys in the top of the meat grinder, and out of the bottom is coming Reform rabbis eating ham sandwiches. So now, and so this is part of like a third component of this. So you have the traditional old world rabbis and the old world Jews that they served. You have the newer generation rabbis and the younger generations of Jews that they would serve, and then you have a huge segment of Yiddish speakers who have become completely secular and aren't interested in religion at all. And so these are people who are deeply engaged in political activity, and particularly in socialist, communist, anarchist political activity, and they see it as their job to mock everybody. So that that's sort of how that functions. That and as I said before, it all becomes part of this process where previous generations change. The old world rabbis aren't as important. They're supplanted by intellectuals, writers, journalists, things like that, and the American rabbinate becomes more akin to a traditional American clergy as opposed to the old world Eastern European rabbi.
Well, we want to thank you. I did take to this that an excellent job, a really very entertaining book, and I think the introduction is well worth reading. There's a great, apparently appeared yesterday in today's New York Times, a fabulous review of the book. I will tell you, I asked him, it wasn't his choice because I didn't like the fact that there's bad rabbi and it's a picture of the 700-pound wrestler, who, by the way, is not a rabbi. So probably would have helped the rabbis to be 700 pounds and wrestle with those individuals that came into their court. However, we want to thank you not only for this gift of this book, but for taking the time to chronicle and to read and understand and to review this mass amount of culture that we have, and to bring out some of the real jewels that are there, both in the humor, and I know that your work that you've done and has done, and there's some great interviews that have been done. There's a radio interview of you on, and there's a couple of great interviews talking about modern culture and Yiddish. So thank you very much. He'll be outside signing books, and have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you at the next Scholar Series.
All right, thank you. Thanks all of you.